He bought the horse out of kindness, never knowing it would carry the truth that set him free. Wyoming, a wind-beaten land where money buys everything, except mercy. When a broke rancher named Eli Carter spent his last dollar on a dying horse, the whole town laughed. But what he saw in the animal's eyes wasn't weakness, it was memory. They called the horse Dust, and from that day on, the past refused to stay buried. Storms rose, bullets flew, and ghosts long forgotten began to whisper through the snow. In a world that had forgotten kindness, one man's compassion would uncover a truth powerful enough to rewrite history and save them both. The autumn wind swept through the small town of Clearwater, Wyoming, carrying the familiar scent of dust, leather, and old hay. It was auction day, one of the last of the season, and the wooden pens behind the old fairground buzzed with the restless movement of cattle, sheep, and horses that had seen better days. Eli Carter stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, his worn boots planted in dirt that seemed as tired as he was. 50 years had carved him into a man of quiet endurance, skin leathered by sun, hands calloused by a lifetime of labor. His ranch, Silver Creek, had once been full of life, the laughter of his wife, the sound of his boy riding bareback in the corral, the clang of hammers fixing fences before sundown. But all that had burned away, literally, on a night 5 years ago when lightning struck and took both barn and family with it. Since then, Eli lived with ghosts. The land had turned against him. Fences sagged, pastures died, debts grew like weeds, and the silence of the ranch was louder than thunder. He hadn't come to buy anything today. Truth be told, he barely had money for a week's food. But habit drew him to the auction yard, where the familiar voices of ranchers and the smell of livestock at least reminded him he was still part of a world that worked with its hands. The auctioneer, a round man with a voice like a whip, called out, "Next up, a gelding, name's Dust, 20 years if he's a day, used for ranch work till he wore down, starting at $50. The horse was led into the ring, a rough-looking chestnut, ribs showing through his dull coat, mane tangled in gray. He limped slightly, one ear bent, one eye clouded with age. Around Eli, the crowd broke into low laughter. $50? You'd get more meat off a coyote, one man snorted. Look at him, he can't even lift his tail straight. Another chuckled. Eli sipped his cold coffee, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horse. Something about the animal's posture stopped him. It stood proud, head high despite the jeers, as though refusing to be ashamed of the years on its back. And then for the briefest heartbeat, the horse's gaze met his. It wasn't the dull stare of a broken animal. There was awareness there. Something old and sorrowful. The auctioneer shrugged. No takers? Going once, going twice? 50, Eli said quietly. Heads turned. The laughter came louder now. Carter's lost his damn mind, someone muttered. The fool's buying ghosts now. Eli ignored them, pressing a few crumpled bills into the clerk's hand. His chest felt heavy, but it wasn't regret. Maybe pity. Maybe hope, the fragile kind he hadn't felt in years. As he walked toward the holding pen, the auctioneer called after him. You want me to throw in a shovel too, Eli? You'll need it when that nag drops dead. The laughter followed him out into the wind. Dust stood quietly when Eli approached. Up close, the horse smelled of rain and old leather. When Eli reached for the lead rope, Dust didn't pull away, just exhaled a long, slow breath through his nostrils, as if accepting his fate. Eli rested a calloused hand on the horse's neck. Guess it's just you and me now, old-timer, he murmured. The road home wound through open grassland turned gold by the fading sun. The wind whistled through broken fences and brittle weeds. Eli walked beside Dust, leading him toward the shape of the ranch that waited on the horizon. The silence between them was strange. comfortable almost. Halfway home, Dust stopped. The horse's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as he stared toward the ridge where an old wooden cross stood crooked in the dirt. It marked the grave of Eli's wife and boy, their resting place overlooking the dry creek bed that had once carried water and laughter through the property. Eli frowned. "Come on now," he said softly, tugging the rope. But Dust didn't move. Instead, the old horse took a step toward the cross, lowered his head, and let out a low, mournful whinny that sent a chill crawling up Eli's spine. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the dying light, the man and the horse, the living and the ghosts, until the wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of old wood and the whisper of grass. Eli finally gave a small nod, tipping his hat toward the cross. "All right," he said quietly. "You've paid your respects. Let's go home." Dust followed without protest, his steps steady and sure. Behind them, the sun dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the world bathed in ember light. And for the first time in years, as the shadows stretched across the lonely ranch road, Eli Carter didn't feel entirely alone. The lane into Silver Creek Ranch curved past a wind-bent cottonwood and a dry trough, then opened on the house, a weathered square of boards and patched shingles, standing like an old soldier who'd outlived his regiment. The windmill creaked above the well, its blades turning slow, complaining whispers against the darkening sky. Fence posts leaned as if too tired to keep standing. The old barn, blackened on one side where fire had licked and taken, hulked against the evening like a bad memory. Eli led Dust to the corral. The latch screeched when he lifted it, same sound it had made when his boy was small, and always running it back and forth, just to hear. He shook the thought off and knelt by the trough. The hand pump fought him at first, but he set his jaw, worked the handle in a steady rhythm, and after a minute the well gave up cold water that splashed into the tin basin bright as coins. Dust lowered his head, lips fluttering, and drank without hurry. Every third swallow, the old horse raised his head and looked toward the ridge where the cross stood, as if taking bearings by a star only he could see. "Won't be much to look at inside," Eli said, "but 4 walls beat the night." He spoke the way men do when they've been alone long enough that sound matters as much as sense. He found a blanket that used to hang across the tack room door and draped it over Dust's back until the horse's ribs stopped shivering. In the barn's half-light, smoke scars climbed the timbers in crooked fingers. Eli could still smell the old fire if he let himself. The sharp, bitter bite of pitch, the sweet, awful scent of burnt hay, a trace of something he never named. He shut the memory away and opened the stall that had once belonged to a bay mare with a white blaze his wife loved. The sign he'd carved for that mare, Mabel, was still nailed to the gate, scorched around the letters. Dust stepped inside and turned once as if measuring the place against some other stall far behind him. He settled, big head easing over the half door. When Eli rubbed the spot between the eyes, he felt the ridge of a healed scar under the forelock, a thin line the width of a knife blade. "You've been through it," he murmured. "Me too." The kitchen lamp fought the dark with a small yellow circle. Eli set a pot on the stove, warmed leftover beans, and ate standing up, looking through the window at a square of night where the barn lantern glowed like a single coal. On the wall beside the window hung a photo in a cracked frame. His wife in her Sunday dress, hair pinned back, eyes laughing. Their boy in a too-big hat, chin lifted like he was already a man. The glass had bubbled from heat along one edge, warping their faces at the corner. He touched the frame with 2 fingers and then let his hand fall. The house kept its old sounds, the click of settling boards, the slow scrape of tree limbs against the eaves, the distant rattle of the windmill. He tried the radio, got nothing but static. Fine. Silence had been his companion long enough. He took a lantern and crossed the yard. Again. Dust's ears flicked when he came near. Eli checked the hoof that had looked a little off. Just long and chipped, no heat. He fetched the rasp, steadying the fetlock in his palm, and worked the edge smooth. The horse bore the handling with patient eyes, as if the relief had been a long time coming. "You don't spook easy," Eli said. "Not for a sale yard nag." He glanced at the scar again. That letter burned into the tough skin low on the neck, the circle around the R. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew men did things to animals to mark them as property. He knew the look of belonging and the look of leaving. Dust had both somehow. Clouds had crowded the moon by the time Eli latched the stall and backed away. In the dark, the barn's roofline was a jagged shadow, cut short where fire had taken the loft. He remembered the heat, the red roar, his wife's hand torn from his when the beam came down, his boy's voice swallowed up. The memory rose the way it always did when night deepened, slow, heavy, and unstoppable as a river breaking ice. He pushed breath out through his teeth and kept walking until the cold got under his collar and made his eyes sting for a different reason. Back in the house, he set the lamp low and took the chair by the stove. The old dog's rug lay empty in the corner, edges gnawed from a lifetime ago. On the table, a stack of bills leaned like a crooked gravestone. Feed, vet, taxes, each with its own threat printed neat at the bottom. Dane Harlow's letter lay on top, short and cold as a blade. Past due, final notice, auction pending. He turned it face down. He didn't sleep, not properly. He drifted in and out, half dreaming old trails and new fences, hearing hoofbeats that weren't there, voices that were gone. Sometime toward midnight, a sound lifted him out of the chair, the sharp clack of metal against wood. He sat, listening. The wind had gone. The world was so quiet he could hear the well rope knock the pipe far off. Then the sound came again, clearer, the barn latch. He took the lantern and crossed the yard, boots whispering through frost-rimmed dirt. A smell rode the air, a dampness, like rain working its way in off the mountains. When he reached the barn door, he found it standing open, the bolt hanging loose. Dust wasn't in the stall. "Hey now," he called, not loud, not wanting to send the horse into a run. "Easy." He found Dust just beyond the threshold, standing in the yard between barn and house, nose up, drawing the air deep like a hound at first light. Eli followed the angle of that long face. The ridge was a shadow on the horizon, and barely visible beyond it, a pale smudge where the cross stood. "You can't go out there," Eli said softly, setting the lantern on a fence post. "Not tonight." Dust dropped his head and took one step toward him, as if in apology, then another step back, as if arguing with himself. Strange thing, the horse was not restless in the way of animals that want to run. He was expectant, like a man at a station platform, listening for a train he knows by the sound of it. Eli stood with him a long minute, hand on the warm neck, feeling the muscle flicker under the skin. A cold bead of rain touched his cheek. Another followed. Then the sky loosened, and a soft, steady fall began. Nothing wild, just a blessing after weeks of dust. The drops made little clicking sounds on the tin of the trough, stitched silver threads down the barn wall, matted Dust's forelock into a dark curl over his eyes. "Yeah," Eli said, half to the horse, half to the night. "We could use a wash." He took Dust's lead rope, but the horse didn't move. He stood there with that same held-breath patience, ears pricked to the darkness. Eli had the oddest feeling, unreasonable but strong, that someone was late, and Dust knew it, and was waiting. Lightning muttered far off over the hills, so faint you could mistake it for a wagon on a distant road. The rain found its rhythm, soft, then softer. Eli felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been bound up so long he'd forgotten how it started. He lifted the rope again, and this time Dust followed him back into the barn, pausing once at the threshold to look out into the rain, as if to mark the smell of it for later. He latched the stall properly, checked it twice, then set the lantern on a hook by the door and leaned against the jamb, listening to the rain settle the dust. Dust watched him, eyes half-lidded, tail swishing slow. Eli nodded, satisfied. "You're safe," he said. "We're all right." The night had other plans. Over the rain, faint and far yet unmistakable, came a sound that hadn't visited Silver Creek in a long time. A single thin whinny from out beyond the ridge, answered by another. So soft it might have been the wind, if not for the way Dust's head snapped up, ears cutting to points. Eli straightened. The hair along his forearms rose. Dust swung his body, bumped the stall door with his chest, and blew hard. A low, urgent sound that said, "Whoa." Eli held up a hand, palm out. "Easy," he whispered, more to his own heart than the horse's. The rain stitched faster across the barn roof. Out in the dark, that distant voice lifted again, clearer this time, and stopped as if swallowed. Dust reached for the latch with his lips, tested the iron, clever and careful. The bolt clinked against the staple, a small, bright noise in the wet dark. Eli stared, lantern light shaking a little on the boards as his hand went unsteady. Dust worried the latch again, patient as a man working a stubborn lock, and the bar slid halfway back with a click that echoed in the old barn like the first note of a song you hadn't heard in years. Eli's breath caught. "Hey, stop that!" He stepped forward, catching the bolt just before it dropped free. The horse froze, head turned, eyes wide with something that looked too much like understanding. Rain rattled on the roof, a soft percussion above their standoff. Eli shook his head and slipped the bar firmly back into place. "You're staying put till morning, partner. That's enough adventure for tonight." Dust snorted, a low, almost offended sound, then turned in the stall, shoulders rolling under the lantern glow. For a moment Eli could see the faint pattern of old scars beneath the slick coat, crosshatch lines like rope burns, an old welt near the withers. But one mark stopped him cold. Just above the shoulder, half hidden by matted hair, was a brand. Not the crude, fresh kind ranchers used to mark stock, but something older, burned deep and precise, a circle around an R. The edges had faded with time, but it was still clear enough to read. Eli frowned, running his fingers gently over the ridged skin. "Where in God's name did you come from?" Dust stood perfectly still, breathing slow. The rain softened into drizzle. Eli leaned closer, lantern held high, the yellow light catching the texture of the brand, the kind of mark you only saw on cavalry mounts or military property, not on a ranch horse. He remembered stories told in the tavern years ago, about an old army post called Redstone that burned down long before his time. Horses branded with that insignia had vanished along with it. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. "You don't make a lick of sense," he muttered. By morning the storm had blown clear. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. A pale fog hung low across the pasture as Eli carried a bucket of oats to the barn. Dust lifted his head and whickered, softly when he saw him. The sound felt like a greeting, maybe even forgiveness for locking him in. Eli poured the feed into a wooden trough, then paused again at the brand. The daylight showed it plainer now, sharp enough that even years couldn't hide it. He needed answers. That afternoon, he saddled the truck instead of the horse and drove into town. The road cut through rolling grass and half-dry creeks, past weathered mailboxes and rusted tractors resting like old bones in the fields. The Clearwater Veterinary Clinic sat at the edge of Main Street, next to the feed store. The sign still leaned to one side, paint flaking in the shape of a running dog. Eli parked out front and stepped out into sunlight that already had bite in it. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and hay. A woman looked up from the counter, wiping her hands on a rag. Her hair was silver-streaked but thick, tied in a loose braid that brushed her shoulder. Clara Dawson. He hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. "Well, I'll be," she said, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Eli Carter in daylight. I thought you'd gone hermit on us for good." "Almost did." He took off his hat, holding it by the brim. "I got something needs looking at." "Dog?" "Horse." Her expression softened. "I didn't think you were still keeping horses." "Wasn't. Picked one up at auction. Couldn't leave him." Clara sighed, the way people do when they understand too well. "You still got that heart of yours where your head ought to be." She walked around the counter, motioning for him to follow. "Tell me what's wrong." "He's old," Eli said. "Ribs showing, gait stiff, but that's not it. He's branded with something I can't make sense of." "What kind of brand?" "Circle around an R." Clara stopped mid-stride. The smile faded from her face. "Say that again." "Circle with an R inside. Looks like it was done a long time ago." Her voice dropped. "You sure it's not a ranch mark?" "Never seen one like it in all Wyoming." Clara's eyes darkened with recognition. "That's a military brand, Eli. Redstone Cavalry. They disbanded before either of us was born." She walked to a filing cabinet in the back room, pulling out a yellowed book with curled corners. She flipped through pages filled with photographs and old registry numbers. "My grandfather served near there. Told me about it. Redstone was an outpost that went up in flames in the 1880s. Official word said lightning struck the powder shed. But folks whispered about something else. A cover-up, missing payroll, a captain who never came home." Eli's brow furrowed. "You mean this horse could be from that outfit?" Clara shut the book. "That'd make him more than 100 years old, which is impossible. But maybe he's a descendant. Could have been passed down, rebranded. Hard to say." "Maybe," Eli said slowly. But he couldn't shake the image of dust staring toward the cross, or the way the horse had pawed the ground like he was remembering where to go. Clara studied him. "You look like a man who's already half convinced himself of something wild." He smiled without humor. "I've seen stranger things than a smart horse." She placed a hand on his arm. "Listen, Eli, if that's a redstone mark, it's tied to bad history. Men died ugly out there. Don't go digging in graves that don't need digging. Promise me that." Eli looked at her hand, then back into her eyes, gray like storm clouds that never quite rained. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Just answers." Well, sometimes those are the same thing. When he returned to the ranch, the sun was lowering again, spilling orange light across the pasture. Dust was waiting by the corral fence, head high, tail swishing lazily. Eli walked up slow, showing the horse the paper rubbing he'd made of the brand with charcoal and cloth. "Redstone," he said aloud. "That mean anything to you?" Dust blinked, then moved closer until Eli could feel warm breath against his chest. The horse's gaze was steady, and for a moment Eli swore the animal knew the name. Night came quick, dragging the cold down with it. Eli sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, staring out across the field where the horse grazed beneath the rising moon. The brand burned in his thoughts. The mystery. The warning in Clara's voice. He remembered what she'd said. Men died ugly out there. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called. Dust lifted his head, ears twitching. The wind shifted, carrying a scent Eli couldn't name. Metallic, faint, almost like old smoke. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the ache in his bones. "You and me, we've both got ghosts, don't we?" he murmured. Dust turned his head toward the ridge again. toward that same lonely cross. The moonlight caught the circle and R on his neck, making it gleam pale as a coin. Eli followed the gaze and felt a prickle crawl up the back of his neck. Somewhere deep down, beneath reason and exhaustion, a voice whispered that this horse hadn't just wandered into his life. He'd come back for something, or someone. And as Eli watched the old gelding stand motionless under the moon, he couldn't help but wonder if the ghosts of Redstone hadn't followed Dust home. Morning came thin and gray, the kind of light that seeps rather than rises. Mist pooled low in the pastures, and the air held a strange stillness, as if the world were waiting for something to move first. Eli woke early, his back stiff from the chair by the stove, the coffee pot cold. Outside, the ranch was wrapped in quiet. He found Dust already awake, standing near the corral gate, head turned toward the ridge. The horse's ears twitched at Eli's approach, but his eyes never left that far-off line of hills. Eli leaned against the fence rail. "You keep staring that way," he said softly. "Ain't nothing up there but rock and wind." Dust flicked an ear, then pawed the ground once, slow, deliberate. It wasn't restlessness, it was intention. Eli frowned. "You want me to follow you again?" He sighed. "All right then, show me." He opened the gate and Dust walked out without hurry, heading across the back pasture. Eli followed, boots crunching in frost-hardened grass. The sun broke through, scattering gold across the hills, and the frost shimmered like tiny mirrors. The horse stopped near a stand of old cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. He lowered his head, sniffed the ground, and pawed at it again, scraping away a thin layer of dirt. Something metallic flashed in the sunlight. Eli crouched down. "What have you found now?" He brushed aside the soil, revealing a small silver object. It was a collar clasp, tarnished green with age, engraved with letters that made his breath hitch. CPT, J. Holbrook. Eli stared, thumb tracing the shallow groove of each letter. Captain Holbrook. He'd heard that name before. Clara had mentioned it when she told him about the Redstone Cavalry, how the captain and his men had vanished after the fire. He looked up at Dust. "You're full of surprises, old boy." He wiped the dirt off the clasp with his sleeve and slipped it into his pocket, feeling a tremor run through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning chill. That afternoon, he drove back into town. Clara was restocking shelves at the clinic when he walked in, holding the clasp between his fingers. "I found this," he said. Her hands froze. "Where?" "Out by the creek behind my property." Dust pawed it up. Clara took the clasp, eyes widening as she read the name. "Holbrook. Eli. This belonged to the Redstone captain. It's real." "I thought maybe," he said, scratching at his beard. "But what's it doing buried on my land?" Clara shook her head. No one knows where Redstone really was. The maps were lost when the army pulled out. People guessed it was near the canyon, but... She looked up at him sharply. "Eli, your ranch might sit right on top of the old site." The words settled between them like falling ash. "That mark on Dust," Eli said slowly. "That R in a circle? It's not just coincidence, is it?" Clara hesitated. "If he's truly from that line, maybe not. There were stories about Holbrook's mount. Said the horse was smarter than any man's, could find its way through the mountains blindfolded. Folks called him Red Dust." Eli blinked. "Red Dust." He looked out the window toward where his truck waited, the reflection of sunlight glinting off the hood like the gleam of the clasp in his pocket. "Guess the name stuck." Clara turned the clasp in her hand. "You should take this to the sheriff. He'll know what to do." Eli took it back gently. "No, not yet. I want to know what happened first. This land's got its own ghosts, Clara. Maybe it's time somebody let 'em speak." Her eyes softened with worry. Just be careful. Secrets buried that long don't always stay quiet when they're found. When he returned home, dusk was already pressing against the hills. He set the clasp on the kitchen table beside the photo of his wife and son. The light caught the engraving just right, and for a moment, he imagined a line of soldiers riding through the same hills he worked every day. The same wind, the same sun, until time swallowed them whole. Outside, dust shifted in the corral, pacing the fence line. Eli stepped out, clasp in hand. The air was cold enough to bite his lungs. "You knew this was here, didn't you?" he said. Dust stopped, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on the silver gleam in Eli's hand. For a long beat, they stood there, the man, the horse, and the memory of a world long dead. The wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. Gun oil, maybe, or blood long dried in the dirt. The hair on Eli's arms lifted. He pocketed the clasp again and went to the barn. As he worked, the unease kept circling his thoughts. That brand, the clasp, the way dust seemed to know where to dig, it all pointed to something too deliberate to ignore. When night came, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with a lantern, watching the darkness beyond the ridge. Somewhere in that black stretch of country, the redstone outpost had burned, and the captain had vanished. He could almost hear the echoes of hoofbeats in the distance, faint as memory, like the ghost of a cavalry riding still. Eli rubbed his face and stood. "Enough foolishness," he muttered. He turned to go back inside, then froze. Dust was standing at the far end of the corral, staring toward the ridge again. The horse's posture was rigid, alert. Eli followed his line of sight. Up there, where the moonlight touched the rocks, something faint glimmered. He squinted. A shape, metallic, half buried near the base of the ridge. Not the shine of water or quartz, but the dull reflection of iron. "Son of a gun," Eli whispered. He grabbed the lantern and headed that way. Dust snorted behind him, pawing the ground. It took a good half-hour to reach the ridge, climbing through grass and scrub. The air grew colder, thinner. When he reached the spot, he found what had caught the light. A rusted military buckle, its brass dulled but still marked with crossed sabers. He brushed away the dirt and set it beside the clasp. The initials on the backplate read U.S. Cavalry. A breeze stirred through the grass, carrying with it the faintest whisper, like the sigh of an old song. Eli looked back toward the ranch, where dust waited in the moonlight, a dark silhouette against the pale earth. "You led me here," Eli said quietly. "Didn't you?" The horse didn't move, only stood with his head bowed slightly, as if acknowledging something only he could feel. Eli knelt again, his hand resting on the buckle. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard other sounds, the soft jingle of harness, the distant murmur of men's voices, and then silence so deep it pressed on his chest. He straightened, suddenly aware of how alone he was out here. "All right, Dust," he called, forcing a steady tone. "That's enough for one night." But the horse stayed where he was, staring toward the mountains, ears flicking to sounds Eli couldn't hear. When Eli turned back toward the ridge, the mist shifted, and for just an instant, in the silvery light, he thought he saw the faint outline of a man standing beside him, tall, in a long coat, hand resting on a saber at his hip. He blinked, and the shape was gone. Only the buckle remained, heavy in his palm. Eli drew a long breath. "Ghosts or not," he said softly, "we've got work to do." He slipped the buckle into his pocket, beside the clasp, and started down the hill. Behind him, dust finally moved, following without command, his steps echoing softly in the sleeping land. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was bleeding over the ridgeline, painting the fields in pale fire. Eli's breath came out in visible clouds as he walked dust into the corral. The horse's coat glowed copper in the first light, like some relic burned clean of its past. Eli ran a hand along the animal's neck and felt the steady pulse under the skin, stronger than before, as if the horse drew new life from old ghosts. "Whatever you're trying to tell me," he said quietly, "I'm listening." But the morning brought no revelations, only the creak of the windmill and the far-off moan of cattle from neighboring land. Eli turned toward the house and froze when he saw a truck parked out front, a glossy black Ford that looked too expensive for their dusty county roads. A man leaned against the hood, arms crossed, the shape of a hat brim cutting a perfect shadow across his face. Dane Harlow. Eli's stomach dropped. Harlow was the kind of rich that came from owning other men's debt. He ran 3 ranches, a gravel pit, and a mining operation up north. His money was old, inherited from the same Harlow family that had made fortunes during the frontier boom and ruined plenty of small ranchers along the way. "Morning, Carter," Harlow said, straightening as Eli approached. His smile was smooth as oiled leather. "You're a hard man to catch at home. Been out treasure hunting?" Eli kept his tone even. "Just mending fence." Harlow chuckled. "Sure you were." He took off his gloves 1 finger at a time. "I came to talk about your note. You're 3 months behind on payments." Eli swallowed the knot in his throat. "You'll get your money. I just need a little more time." "Time's the one thing I don't sell." Harlow's eyes drifted toward the corral. "That your new horse? Not much to look at. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." Eli said nothing. Dust stood still, watching them both, ears pricked. Harlow smirked. "I'll tell you what, Carter. I'm a generous man. You clear the debt by the end of the week, or I'll take the deed. Ranch, water rights, the whole lot. If you can't," he tilted his head, feigning sympathy, "well, maybe I'll buy that nag off you. Be worth something to feed my hounds." Eli's jaw tightened. "This ranch has been in my family 3 generations. I won't let you have it." "You won't have a choice." Harlow turned back toward his truck, then paused. "Funny thing, though," he added. "My daddy used to tell stories about this land. Said soldiers once camped here before the railroad came. A captain with a payroll shipment that vanished. Ever hear that one?" Eli's breath hitched. "No." Harlow's grin widened just enough to show teeth. "Maybe you ought to ask your horse. Looks like he's got secrets." Eli took a step forward. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means," Harlow said, settling his hat, "some debts are older than paper." He climbed into the truck, gravel crunching under the tires as he drove off, leaving a curtain of dust in his wake. Eli stood there long after the sound faded. Dust let out a low, uneasy nicker. Eli turned toward him. "You hear that name before, didn't you? Harlow." The horse's tail flicked once, muscles tightening beneath the skin. For a heartbeat, Eli thought he saw something flare behind those dark eyes. Anger, recognition, something human. Then it was gone. Inside, Eli poured coffee with shaking hands. He unfolded Harlow's letter, the one stamped final notice, and stared at the figures. There wasn't a chance in hell he could pay that kind of money in a week. The ranch would be gone, just another trophy for the man who already owned half the valley. His gaze drifted to the table where the Holbrook clasp and buckle lay beside the lamp. Their dull gleam seemed to mock him. Maybe Harlow was right. Maybe this land carried a debt older than either of them. The next few days passed like a slow fever. Eli repaired fences he couldn't afford to fix and slept little, the weight of the debt pressing down on him. Every night, he found himself drawn back to the artifacts. He would polish the metal until the letters shone again, CPTJ Holbrook, and wonder what truth they guarded. By the 4th morning, the sky turned the color of tarnished steel. Eli was checking the east pasture when the roar of an engine broke the quiet. Harlow's truck again, this time kicking up a trail of red dust that cut straight toward the ranch. Eli met him halfway, hands tucked into his coat pockets to keep them from shaking. "You bringin' the deed already?" "Not yet," Harlow said, stepping out. His boots were too clean for real work. "Just thought I'd check on my investment. Heard you been digging around up in those hills. Just fixin' a fence. That right?" Harlow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "See, my men found old military gear out that way years back. Buttons, bits of brass, probably from the Redstone fire. Place was a slaughter, you know, my, grandfather told me." Eli met his stare. "What's your point?" "My point is," Harlow said, leaning in close, "some things ought to stay buried. That's how they keep their value." He looked past Eli toward the corral, where dust had come up to the fence, ears forward. The old horse's presence seemed to irk him. "That's the one, isn't it?" "What?" "The horse. My father told me stories about a cavalry mount with a mark just like that, circle and R. Said it was cursed. Every man who owned it died broke or worse." Eli's heart thudded. "Sounds like superstition to me." Harlow smirked. "Maybe. Or maybe it's bad luck sticking to bad blood." He clapped Eli's shoulder with mock warmth. "1 week, Carter. After that, I'll send the papers. Enjoy your ghost horse." Eli watched him leave again, fury crawling like heat under his skin. Dust pawed the ground, snorting, as if sharing his anger. "He's bluffing," Eli muttered. "He's got nothing but talk." But he wasn't sure. That night, the wind turned sharp, whistling through gaps in the barn boards. Eli sat beside Dust, running his hands along the horse's neck. Beneath the skin, he could feel the deep scar of the brand, that R in the circle, as if it pulsed faintly under his touch. "Who were you?" he whispered. The horse stirred, blowing warm breath against Eli's sleeve. Then, out of nowhere, Dust's muscles bunched. He threw his head toward the door, eyes wide. A faint sound carried through the night, the hum of an engine, distant but steady. Eli peered through a crack in the boards. Headlights glowed on the ridge. 2, maybe 3 trucks creeping along the upper road. "Damn it!" he hissed. He doused the lantern and crouched low. Dust stood tense beside him, silent except for the slow flare of his nostrils. The trucks idled for a long moment, then moved on, their lights fading. Eli exhaled, shaking his head. "Looks like Harlow's keeping tabs." He ran a hand over Dust's mane. "Don't you worry. He's not taking this place. Not you, neither." The horse turned his head slightly, pressing his nose to Eli's shoulder, a simple gesture, but it steadied him more than words ever could. By dawn, the trucks were gone, leaving only tire ruts in the mud. Eli walked out to the ridge, boots sinking in wet earth, and looked toward the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and snow. He pulled the clasp from his pocket, turning it in his hand. "Holbrook," he said under his breath. "What did they do to you out here?" Behind him, Dust let out a low nicker that almost sounded like an answer. The light broke over the hills then, hard and bright, casting long shadows across the land, across a man running out of time and a horse who seemed to remember too much. The morning carried a strange weight with it, the kind that settles before something breaks. The air was heavy, windless, and cold. Over the sun, mountains, bruised clouds were piling up like slow-moving giants. Eli Carter could smell the change before he saw it. He'd grown up in these valleys. He knew when the sky was about to turn mean. He spent the morning in silence, repairing the barn roof with what little lumber he had left. Each nail he drove felt like a small act of defiance against time, debt, and the storm rolling in. Dust watched from the corral, ears twitching at every sound, his coat dark against the pale sky. "You feel it too, don't you?" Eli muttered. "Weather's comin'." By noon, the wind picked up, a low moan sweeping through the grasslands. Eli moved Dust into the barn and hung an extra lantern by the door. He closed the shutters and checked the latch on the stall twice. He'd seen too many winters tear apart men less stubborn than him. Thunder cracked in the distance, rolling across the valley like cannon fire. Dust shifted in his stall, muscles tense, nostrils flaring. Eli reached out, patting his neck. "Easy now. It's just noise." The horse's head jerked toward the open hayloft window, ears pinned forward. A moment later, lightning flashed, and the rain began, a sudden wall of water hammering the roof. The barn creaked and groaned as the wind howled through its seams. Eli backed toward the workbench, grabbing a lantern just as the power flickered out. "Figures," he said, shaking his head. The storm outside roared louder, drowning his voice. He could barely hear the horses breathing over the wind. Then, beneath the thunder, he caught another sound, a sharp crack, different from the rest. The roof beam above Dust shuddered, the nails squealing in protest. Eli's stomach dropped. "Hold on!" he shouted, running forward. He reached Dust's stall just as part of the roof caved in, splintering under the force of the wind. Wood and debris crashed down, grazing Eli's shoulder. Pain shot through him like fire, but he kept moving, fumbling with the latch. "Move, boy! Out!" Dust didn't need a second command. The horse shoved the stall door with his chest, breaking the latch clean off. Eli stumbled back as Dust pushed through the gap, grabbed Eli's jacket collar gently with his teeth, and pulled him away from the falling beam. The sound of splintering timber filled the air. When the two of them burst into the open, the wind hit like a living thing, cold and wild, full of grit and rain. Eli coughed, blinking against the downpour. "You just saved my hide!" he shouted over the storm. Dust pressed close, trembling but steady, his body a wall of heat against the cold. The rain came harder, turning the yard into mud. Eli tried to lead Dust toward the lean-to by the old feed shed, but the horse hesitated, pulling toward the ridge. Lightning split the sky again, lighting the valley in a ghostly white. "Not now, Dust," Eli called, but the horse wouldn't move. He was staring at something beyond the property line, ears fixed, stance rigid. Eli followed the gaze. For a moment, all he saw was wind-torn grass and sheets of rain. Then the lightning came again, and he saw it. A shape on the ridge, half buried under mud and roots. At first, he thought it was a boulder, but the next flash showed edges. Man-made, deliberate. A slab of stone, flat and carved, the letters barely visible through the storm. Redstone Outpost. Eli's heart hammered in his chest. "That's impossible!" Dust let out a deep, almost mournful sound, lowering his head toward the ridge as the rain beat down. Eli's voice caught in his throat. The wind howled around them, but in that moment it felt like the storm itself had gone silent. The horse took one slow step forward, then another, toward the ridge. Eli hesitated, torn between following and the instinct to seek shelter. Lightning tore open the sky again, closer this time, the thunder snapping like gunfire. He couldn't leave the horse out here. He threw his arm over his face and ran after him. The climb was brutal, the mud slick, the wind pushing him sideways. Twice he fell, once nearly losing his footing altogether. But Dust was already there, standing before the half-exposed stone, rain streaking down his coat like sweat. Eli knelt beside the marker, brushing away the muck with his hands until the full inscription came clear. Redstone Outpost, Gaston, 1876, U.S. Cavalry. Below the words carved faintly was something smaller, for those who never returned. Eli stared at the letters until the rain blurred them. "You led me here," he whispered. The wind seemed to pause for half a heartbeat, then picked up again, carrying a sound that wasn't thunder. It was faint, almost swallowed by the storm. But Eli heard it all the same. The echo of hooves on hard ground, distant and rhythmic, like a parade marching somewhere beyond sight. Dust lifted his head and neighed, the sound long and low, cutting through the rain like a call answered across centuries. Eli's breath trembled. He rose to his feet and looked out over the valley. The dark shapes of the land seemed different now, the contours shifting under lightning's flash. He could almost imagine tents once pitched along the creek bed, smoke rising from campfires, men moving between them. But it was only the storm and an old horse who remembered. "Let's go home," Eli said at last. He led Dust back through the mud, both of them soaked to the bone. The barn roof had collapsed entirely on one side, the wreckage steaming under the rain. Eli tied a tarp across the opening and got Dust settled in the feed shed, wrapping the old horse in a blanket and setting a lantern nearby. When the worst of the storm finally passed, he sank to the ground beside Dust, the steady drum of rain easing to a soft patter. His shoulder throbbed from where the beam had hit him, but his mind was louder than the pain. He couldn't stop thinking about that stone, the name carved into it, the artifacts in his pocket, the buckle, the clasp, and now this. Each discovery tied him tighter to something he didn't yet understand. Dust shifted beside him, lowering his head until his muzzle rested near Eli's knee. The gesture was quiet, deliberate, and full of a comfort that didn't need words. "You've been trying to tell me something, haven't you?" Eli murmured. The horse's ear flicked at the sound of his voice. "All right, old boy. I'll listen. I promise." Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing a sliver of moon. The light fell across the mud, glinting off the wet earth where hoof prints led up to the ridge, and beside them, faint impressions of something else. Not horseshoes. Boots. Eli froze. The prints were fresh, half filled with rainwater, leading away from the ridge toward the hills. He looked back toward Dust, whose gaze was fixed on those same tracks. A chill crept through Eli's chest that had nothing to do with the storm. They weren't alone out there. Eli's breath caught as he stared at the prints filling with rainwater. They weren't his. He hadn't walked that way. And they sure weren't from any ranch hand. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, pressed deep enough to belong to someone carrying weight or fear. He crouched, running a calloused finger along the outline. Boot heels. Wide stride. More than one pair. His pulse kicked in his throat. Someone else had been by that ridge recently, maybe even during the storm. "Who'd be wandering out here in weather like that?" he muttered. Dust snorted softly, ears flicking back toward the hills as if he knew the answer. The horse took a half step closer to the ridge again, muscles tight, nostrils flaring at the wind that swept down through the pines. Eli straightened. "No, not tonight. We're done chasing ghosts in the dark." Still, the unease clung to him like wet wool. Back inside the feed shed, he checked the lantern's wick, fed Dust a few handfuls of grain, and laid a blanket across the old horse's back. The animal was calm again, eyes heavy, but his tail flicked once when thunder rolled far off. Eli leaned against the doorframe, the lantern light drawing a soft halo around them both. "We'll figure it out in the morning. Whatever this is, whoever's been out there, it's connected to you, isn't it?" Dust lowered his head, breathing warm against Eli's arm. The gesture steadied him enough to let exhaustion win. He dozed in a chair beside the stall, the rain easing outside until the only sound left was the steady drip from the roof and the slow rhythm of Dust's breathing. When morning came, the world felt washed clean. Mist clung to the ground, thin and ghostly. The storm had stripped the hills bare, revealing veins of red clay and stone glinting in the early light. Eli saddled Dust after breakfast, careful with the horse's still stiff muscles. Let's see where those tracks go, he said. The trail led back to the ridge. The footprints were clearer now. 2 sets, both heading east toward a narrow cut in the hill where the creek once ran before the drought. Eli followed them slowly, scanning the ground, every sense sharpened. Halfway up the slope, Dust stopped. His body went rigid, ears pinned forward. Eli followed the horse's gaze. There, beneath a scatter of broken branches, the ground looked wrong. The earth was darker, looser, like it had been disturbed recently. Eli dismounted, heart thudding. He knelt beside the spot and began to scrape the soil away with his hands. At first, it was just dirt and roots. Then his fingers struck something solid, metal, cold and curved. He brushed it clean, revealing a rusted spur, its rowel broken, half buried in clay. "Cavalry issue," he murmured. He dug deeper, uncovering more metal, a belt buckle, a fragment of leather, and then something pale that made him stop breathing. Bone. Eli sat back on his heels, staring. "Lord above." Dust stood behind him, silent, watching. The old horse pawed the ground once as if marking the place. Eli swallowed hard and kept digging, careful now. After a few minutes, the shape of a ribcage emerged, then a skull, the jaw still partly intact. The skeleton was curled awkwardly, one arm stretched toward a shallow hollow beside it. Clutched in the bony fingers was something wrapped in oilcloth. Eli hesitated, then gently pulled it free. The fabric fell apart at his touch, and inside was a piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle but still legible. The ink was faint, the handwriting cramped but careful. It read, "If this reaches honest hands, know that Captain J. Holbrook was betrayed by his own. Dane Harlow Sr. took the gold meant for the men and left us to burn. Tell the truth, and may the guilty line never prosper." Eli's stomach turned to ice. Dane Harlow. The name hit him like a hammer blow. He stared at the paper, his mind reeling. Harlow's family, the same one that now owned half the valley, had stolen from their own men and covered it up with fire. He looked back at the bones. "You were one of his soldiers, weren't you? One who didn't make it out." The wind sighed through the trees, and for a moment, he could almost hear the faint jingle of bridles and the rustle of uniforms long turned to dust. Eli folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat. He stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "We'll tell the sheriff," he said aloud, though the conviction in his voice faltered. But another voice, quieter and more cautious, whispered in the back of his mind, "If you do, Harlow will find out first." Dust turned, looking back toward the ranch. Eli gave one last glance at the shallow grave, the bones now half exposed to sunlight after decades underground. "I'll come back for you," he promised. "You've been forgotten too long." By late afternoon, clouds were gathering again, thin at first, then thickening into the color of iron. Eli was in the barn, scrubbing dirt from under his fingernails, when he heard a truck engine rumble up the drive. His heart sank even before he stepped outside. Harlow. The man climbed out of his truck with the easy arrogance of someone who believed every acre he touched already belonged to him. "Afternoon, Carter," he said, smiling like a snake. "Heard you been poking around those hills." Eli's hand clenched at his side. "Just fixin' fence." "Sure," Harlow said, eyeing the mud on Eli's boots. "Shame if something valuable turned up out there. Things that belong to the government, or to folks who know how to use them better." Eli didn't answer. Harlow took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "You and me. We've got history between our families. Best not to stir it up." Eli met his gaze. "You talk like you already know what I found." Harlow smiled thinly. "Maybe I do." Something flickered in his expression, a hint of unease, quickly buried. He tipped his hat. "You've got 2 days, Carter. Pay the note, or I take the land. Don't test me." When he drove off, Eli stood there for a long time, jaw tight. Behind him, dust shifted in the corral, blowing softly through his nose. Eli turned toward the horse. "He knows," he said. "Somehow, he knows." The horse stepped closer, pressing against the fence rails. His eyes were dark and steady. Eli rested his hand between them, feeling that strange current again, something deeper than instinct, as if the horse could feel the truth pulsing through his blood. "You and me," Eli said, voice low. "We've got a reckoning coming." A gust of wind swept through the yard, bending the grass flat. Eli looked up toward the ridge. The grave he'd uncovered was just out of sight, but he could feel it there, waiting. And deep in the valley, thunder murmured again, as if the dead were speaking. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky scoured clean and cold. The smell of wet sage hung heavy over the ranch. Eli Carter sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee that had gone cold long before he remembered to drink it. His hands were still streaked with dirt from yesterday's digging. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bones, curled, reaching, clutching that brittle confession. Harlow's words echoed in his mind. "Don't stir up our history." He knew now why the man had come sniffing around. Harlow's family secret wasn't some rumor in an old tavern. It was carved right into this land, same as the redstone stone marker itself. Dane Harlow Sr. had betrayed his own men, stolen the gold, and buried the truth under smoke and lies. And if the letter he found was real, then Harlow's empire, everything that family built, was born from blood. Eli stood, restless. The ranch was too quiet. Even the birds had gone still. Dust watched him from the corral, tail swishing slow, eyes dark and unreadable. "Looks like we kicked a hornet's nest," Eli said softly. He went to the barn and packed a small canvas bag. The letter, the clasp, the buckle. If anyone could help him figure out what to do next, it was Clara Dawson. The drive into Chemin, Clearwater, took longer than usual. The dirt road had turned to a patchwork of mud from the storm. When he pulled up at the veterinary clinic, Clara was sweeping the porch. She looked up at the sound of his truck and frowned. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. "I haven't." Eli handed her the folded paper. "Found this yesterday near that redstone marker." She unfolded it carefully, reading each line twice. Her face paled. "My God, Eli, this name's Harlow's father." "I know. Do you realize what this means? If this is genuine, it's proof of a federal crime, buried for almost a century." Eli nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "And you can bet Dane Harlow knows it. He's been circling me like a buzzard ever since." Clara bit her lip. "You can't stay here. Not if he thinks you're sitting on something that could ruin him." "I'm not running." "You might not have a choice." Before Eli could answer, a horn blared outside. They both turned toward the window. A black truck rolled past the clinic slowly, Harlow's men. Two of them sat in the cab, one in back. They didn't stop, but they didn't need to. Their meaning was clear. Clara exhaled shakily. "He's watching you." Eli forced a tight smile. "Then let him. I ain't hiding." He left town before noon. The sky had turned sharp blue, but the wind carried a bite. When he reached the ranch, something felt wrong. Dust wasn't at the corral. The gate hung open. The latch twisted off like someone had pried it loose with a crowbar. Eli's stomach clenched. He jogged toward the barn, calling out, "Dust?" His voice echoed back empty. The barn doors were wide open. Inside, straw was scattered across the floor, and the feed bin had been kicked over. In the corner was one of Harlow's cigarette butts. "Damn it," Eli muttered, panic tightening in his throat. He ran outside, scanning the pasture. In the distance, faint tire tracks cut across the wet soil toward the canyon road. They took him. Without thinking, Eli jumped into his truck and gunned the engine. Mud sprayed from the tires as he tore out of the driveway, following the ruts down the valley. The road curved toward the canyon, the same one he'd seen from the ridge where Redstone's marker stood. Halfway there, smoke began to rise in the distance, a thin, dirty plume curling into the sky. His heart lurched. He reached the canyon just in time to see flames licking the edges of his feed wagon, overturned beside the old dry creek. Dust stood tethered nearby, rearing against a rope tied to a fence post. Two men in work jackets were struggling to control him, one shouting over the other. "Easy, you stupid nag!" Eli slammed the truck door open. "Hey!" Both men turned. One grabbed for something under his coat. Eli ducked behind the hood as a shot cracked through the air, ricocheting off metal. "Enough!" Eli roared. He stepped out, his old Winchester in hand, the same rifle he'd kept since his father's days. He didn't point it yet. He didn't have to. His voice was hard enough. "You let go of that horse." The younger man hesitated. "We were just—" "Now!" The older man sneered but released the rope. Dust bolted free, hooves throwing mud as he ran to Eli, trembling and wild-eyed. Eli grabbed his halter, speaking low, steadying him. When he looked up again, the two men were gone, their truck already fishtailing down the road. The fire crackled behind him, chewing through the wagon. Eli turned back toward Dust. The horse was bleeding from a cut along his shoulder, but it wasn't deep. Still, the sight of it lit a fuse inside Eli he hadn't felt in years. "That's enough," he said under his breath. "No more." By the time he got Dust back to the ranch, the sun was sinking. He cleaned the wound as best he could, wrapping it tight. Clara arrived an hour later, her coat dusted with road grit. "I saw the smoke from town," she said, breathless. "What happened?" "Harlow's men tried to kill him." Clara's eyes widened. "Eli—" "I'm fine," he cut in. "But I'm done waiting. They wanted a fight. They've got one." She stepped closer, voice trembling. "You can't take him on alone. He owns the sheriff, half the county." Eli looked past her, toward the ridge where the Redstone stone marker caught the last of the evening light. "Maybe so, but I've got something he doesn't. Truth. And this horse. He remembers." Clara followed his gaze. "Remembers what?" "I don't know yet. But whatever happened to Holbrook, Dust saw it." The wind rose, carrying the dry smell of smoke and sage. Eli turned back toward the barn. "We're going to finish what they started." Clara touched his arm. "If you're right, if Dust really was there, then the proof might still be out there too." Eli nodded. "Tomorrow, we ride." That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees, watching lightning flicker over the distant mountains. Dust grazed quietly nearby, his shadow long and still in the silver light. Eli's shoulder throbbed where the old storm beam had hit him days before, but he ignored it. His mind was alive with everything he'd learned. The grave, the letter, the brand on Dust's neck, and now the attack. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about blood. As the first hint of dawn crept into the sky, Eli stood and looked out toward the hills. The land was waking up again, the same way it had every morning since men first rode here. But today, the ghosts weren't resting, and neither was he. Eli rose before the light had fully reached the valley. The air was sharp, brittle with frost, and every sound carried like it had been struck on glass. Dust stood near the corral gate, steam rising from his nostrils, the morning sun painting a faint glow along his mane. The cut on the horse's shoulder had scabbed clean, but a faint tremor still rippled through the muscle beneath it. Eli rested a hand there, the way you would on the shoulder of a friend about to face something hard. "You held up better than I did," he murmured. But it's not over yet. He saddled up with slow, deliberate care, checking every strap twice. The rifle went in its scabbard, the folded letter and the silver clasp tucked inside his coat pocket. He could almost hear Clara's voice echoing from last night. You can't take him on alone. She was right. But Eli had never been much for taking advice once he'd made up his mind. He rode into town by mid-morning, keeping to the back roads where the cottonwoods crowded close. The sheriff's office sat on the corner of Main Street across from the feed store. The old wooden sign faded almost to blank. Sheriff Nolan was standing out front with a coffee in one hand and yesterday's newspaper in the other. When Eli dismounted, Nolan's brow furrowed. Carter, heard you had some excitement out your way. Depends on what you call excitement. Eli pulled the folded paper from his coat. Found this on my property. Thought you might want to see. Nolan took the letter, unfolding it slowly. His lips moved as he read, his frown deepening line by line. When he finished, he let out a low whistle. This says Dane Harlow's daddy robbed a cavalry payroll and killed a captain. Not just says it. It was written by one of the men who died out there. Nolan looked up. You sure this isn't a hoax? Folks dig up all kinds of stories when they're feuding with their neighbors. Eli's jaw tightened. You think I'd make this up? You think I'd shoot holes in my own barn for fun? I'm saying Harlow's powerful, Nolan said quietly. The man's got judges on his Christmas list. If I open this, it's going to stir dust that's been settled a long time. Eli leaned forward. It's already stirred. Nolan looked down again at the paper. The signature at the bottom, barely legible but still clear enough to read, seemed to shake him. All right, he said at last. Let me hang on to it for a bit. I'll see what I can find. Eli nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. He turned to leave, but Nolan's voice stopped him. Carter, watch your back. Men like Harlow don't take kindly to ghosts coming back to life. By the time Eli got back to the ranch, the sun was low, a burnished red sinking into the horizon. Dust grazed quietly by the fence, head lifting when Eli rode in. Everything looked calm, ordinary, until Eli reached the porch. The front door was open. He swung, down fast, boots hitting the dirt. The hinges creaked in the wind as he stepped inside. His stomach dropped. The kitchen was a wreck. Chairs overturned, papers scattered across the floor, drawers pulled out and dumped. Someone had been searching for something. Eli's heart hammered as he crossed the room. The tin box where he'd kept the artifacts, the clasp and buckle, was gone. He looked around, fists clenched, pulse roaring in his ears. Damn you, Harlow, he whispered. He backed onto the porch, scanning the darkening fields. Dust had moved closer to the corral gate. Ears flicked sharply toward the road. A second later, Eli heard it too, the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights cut across the trees, crawling toward the ranch like slow fire. Eli's breath came short. He moved quick, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. The truck's motor roared as it drew nearer. It stopped halfway down the lane, lights off, but engines still running. Eli crouched behind the porch post, watching. A door opened. Two men stepped out, silhouettes against the glow of the dashboard. He recognized one instantly, the same man who'd held Dust's lead rope by the creek. Boss says he's got what he wanted, the man called out, voice slurred from distance or drink. Told us to make sure Carter understands not to go looking again. Eli's stomach turned to ice. He heard the sound of a shotgun being pumped. Dust's whinny cut through the night like a blade. The horse tore through the corral gate before Eli could move, hooves striking sparks off the stones. The sudden motion startled the men. One shouted, "What the hell?" and fired. The shot went wide, slicing through air and darkness. Dust hit one man full force, sending him sprawling into the mud. The other spun, firing again. Eli fired once from the porch, the crack echoing like thunder. The shooter's hat flew off, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Get in the truck!" the downed man shouted. They scrambled back, tires spinning as they tore out down the road, leaving behind the stench of exhaust and gunpowder. Eli lowered the rifle, his breath ragged. Dust stood trembling near the porch, flanks streaked with sweat and dirt. The horse's shoulder was grazed again, a thin red line cutting across old scars. Eli dropped the gun and went to him, gripping the halter tight. "Easy, easy now." Dust blew hard through his nose, shaking, but didn't pull away. The night around them went still again, save for the ticking of the cooling engine and the hiss of wind through the grass. Eli's knees nearly gave out. He leaned his forehead against Dust's neck. "You crazy, beautiful fool," he whispered. "You saved me again." When the shaking stopped, he straightened and looked back toward the road. The truck had vanished, but in its place the ranch was quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace. By morning, the sheriff's truck rolled up the lane. Nolan climbed out, hat in hand. "Heard shots last night." Eli told him everything: the break-in, the men, the attack. Nolan listened without writing a word. When Eli finished, the sheriff sighed. "Those artifacts you found, whatever was in that box, Harlow's got 'em now." "I figured as much." "He brought 'em to town early this morning, claimed they were evidence of a Civil War shipment lost on his property, said you'd been trespassing." Eli felt the blood drain from his face. "He's stealing history twice over." Nolan looked away. "I can't stop him without proof, and the only man who's got that proof is standing right here." Eli clenched his fists. "Then I'll find it again." The sheriff's voice dropped. "Eli, let it go." But he couldn't. The land itself was calling now, whispering through the wind and the dust. And Dust, the horse who shouldn't know anything, kept staring east, toward the hills, toward where the truth waited buried under dirt and time. That evening, Eli packed light again. He saddled Dust, the old gelding standing steady, as if he understood every word. Clara came just as the last light faded. "You can't," she said, when she saw the rifle. "Not alone." "I've been alone most of my life," Eli said, "but not tonight." She followed his gaze to Dust, then nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "Be careful." Eli touched the brim of his hat. "Always." They rode out as the stars clemmed into a sky as black as iron. Behind them, the ranch lay small and still, a lone lantern glowing faint on the porch. Ahead, the ridge waited, where bones, lies, and bloodlines tangled together in the dark. And if the thunder rolling over the mountains sounded like a drum, it was only fitting. The ghosts of Redstone were marching again. By midnight, the wind had turned bitter. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then thicker, spinning through the moonlight like ghost ash. Eli leaned low over Dust's neck, guiding the horse through the narrowing trail that climbed toward the canyon. Every breath turned to steam in the cold air. His coat was stiff with frost, his fingers numb around the reins. They'd been riding for hours, following the ridge road east, the same road Harlow's men had used to reach the old mining flats. That's where Dust had started leading, ears pricked and head down, his movements full of quiet purpose. Eli trusted the horse's instincts more than his own by now. "Harlow's got the artifacts," Eli said, his voice hoarse in the wind. "He's after the rest of it, whatever's buried out here. We find it first, or we don't find it at all." Dust tossed his head as if in answer. They reached the first narrow pass by dawn. The land opened into a long basin rimmed with pines dusted white. Snow was falling harder now, the world shrinking to shades of gray and silver. Eli could just make out the faint tracks of a truck in the drifts, a heavy vehicle, tires cutting deep. He dismounted, crouched to study the ruts. They were here last night, he murmured, headed toward the old mine road. A gust of wind rose, swirling snow across the trail, wiping the prints clean almost as fast as he could trace them. Eli swung back into the saddle. Come on, Dust. Let's end this. The climb grew steeper. Rocks jutted through the snow, and the path wound between dark walls of granite that seemed to press in from both sides. The horse's breath came hard and rhythmic, his hooves striking dull echoes off the stone. When they finally crested the ridge, Eli reined in sharply. Down below, in the shallow bowl of the canyon, 3 trucks sat idling beside the black mouth of an abandoned mine shaft. Men moved around them, 6, maybe 7, all carrying rifles, and there, tied near the vehicles, was a sight that made Eli's stomach twist. Another horse, Dust's halter, the one Harlow's men had stolen days ago, hanging from its neck. They'd used it as bait. They want us to come to them, Eli muttered. Well, they got their wish. He slid from the saddle and crouched behind a boulder, glassing the scene through his rifle scope. Harlow himself was there, coat collar turned up against the cold, his breath visible in short, angry bursts. He was barking orders to the others, pointing toward the mine entrance. Eli couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. Harlow had found the rest of the redstone site. He was going to take whatever the cavalry had hidden and bury the truth again with Eli on top of it. A sharp crack split the air. The echo rolled across the canyon. One of Harlow's men had spotted him. A bullet smacked into the rock inches from his face, spraying stone chips into his cheek. Go! Eli shouted, vaulting onto Dust's back. The horse lunged forward, sliding down the snowy slope in a shower of powder. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets hissed through the snow, snapping branches, chewing into frozen dirt. Eli flattened against Dust's neck, every muscle braced. The horse ran with a strength that didn't belong to his years, weaving between boulders, hooves striking sparks off the hidden stone. They hit the canyon floor hard, snow exploding around them. Harlow's men shouted, their trucks revving. Headlights flared through the storm like eyes of some mechanical beast. Eli swung left, heading for the creek bed, a narrow cut that wound out of the canyon like a snake. Dust took the turn without hesitation, sliding through ice and water, then pounding up the far slope. Behind them came the growl of engines, closer now. A bullet clipped Eli's hat clean off. He ducked low, teeth gritted. Not today, he hissed. The world narrowed to the rhythm of hooves, the crack of rifles, the white roar of the blizzard. He didn't know where Dust was leading him anymore, only that the horse moved like he'd run this trail 100 times before. They burst out onto a high ridge overlooking the valley below. The snow was coming sideways now, the wind screaming. Dust stopped suddenly, blowing hard, muscles quivering. Ahead lay a drop, a sheer wall of ice and rock plunging into the shadowed basin. Behind them, engines roared closer. Eli looked back to see headlights climbing through the storm. He could hear men shouting, the crunch of boots in snow. We're boxed in, he whispered. Dust shifted under him, ears flicking forward. The horse turned slightly, his head angling toward a narrow path that cut along the cliff face, barely wide enough for a man, let alone a horse. Eli followed his gaze and felt his gut tighten. You can't be serious. But Dust stepped forward, sure and steady, like he'd walked that ledge before. God help us both, Eli muttered. He loosened the reins and let the horse choose the way. The path was treacherous, a thread of frozen rock winding along the canyon wall. Below, the valley yawned open, dizzying in the faint gray light. Dust's hooves found purchase where no sane horse would have dared. Snow cascaded down from their passage in white sheets. Behind them, the first of Harlow's men reached the top of the ridge. There, someone shouted. Gunfire cracked, echoing down the canyon. A round struck the rock near Dust's hind leg, showering them both with shards. The horse flinched, but didn't falter. Eli returned fire once, the sound of his rifle swallowed by the storm. He didn't wait to see if it hit. He just kept going, praying the ledge didn't crumble beneath them. Then the path widened suddenly, opening into a hollow cut into the cliff, a natural alcove half hidden by snow and brush. Dust stopped there, sides heaving. Eli slid off and pressed a hand to the horse's neck. "You did good, boy. Real good." Below them, the truck's headlights swept the canyon floor, searching. Harlow's voice carried faintly through the storm, furious and wild. Eli crouched beside the rock wall, trying to catch his breath. The alcove was deeper than it looked, sloping gently into the stone. He raised his lantern, the flicker of light catching something carved into the rock, letters half buried in ice. MT, 1876. Eli froze. "Marcus Thornfield," he whispered, the lost captain's initials. He pressed his hand against the carving. The stone felt cold, but solid, real. This was it, the hiding place the Redstone men had died for. Dust snorted behind him, pawing the ground. Eli turned. The horse's hoof had struck something hollow. He brushed away snow and found the edge of a wooden crate buried in the frozen earth. The same kind of crate he'd unearthed pieces of before, stenciled faintly with the words, U.S. Army Payroll. Eli's pulse thundered. "We found it," he breathed. But below, voices were growing louder. Flashlights cut through the storm, beams sweeping the rock walls. Harlow's men were climbing. Eli's mind raced. He had no time to dig the crate free, no time to think. Dust moved close, nudging his shoulder, urging him toward the back of the alcove. A narrow crack in the rock led deeper into the mountain, a passage just wide enough for a man and a horse. Eli hesitated, then ducked inside. The darkness swallowed them, the sound of the storm fading behind. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air sharp with the scent of old earth and iron. Eli held the lantern high, his other hand brushing the stone for balance. Behind him, Dust's hooves echoed steady and slow. When they finally emerged, it was into open air again, the other side of the ridge. The storm had eased there, a clear break in the clouds revealing the valley far below. Eli turned to Dust, breathless, snow-caked in his beard. "You remembered," he said softly. "You remembered the way out." Below them, the faint sound of shouting carried on the wind. Harlow's men would find the alcove soon enough, but they wouldn't find him, or the treasure. Eli looked back once at the ridge, then down at the valley ahead. "Come on, old friend," he said, swinging into the saddle. "Let's finish what they started." And with that, man and horse disappeared into the snow, leaving the ghosts of Redstone behind them once more, still restless, but finally beginning to stir toward the light. The storm broke near dawn. The clouds tore open, spilling thin rays of sunlight that painted the frozen valley in silver. Eli and Dust stumbled out of the foothills, the horse's flanks white with frost, Eli's hands raw and cracked from the cold. For hours they had ridden without rest, until the mountains behind them faded into mist and memory. At last Eli pulled Dust to a halt by a stand of pines overlooking the lowlands. His breath came in ragged gasps. "We made it," he whispered, voice half broken with exhaustion. Dust shook his mane, steam curling from his nostrils in the chill air. Eli slid from the saddle and sank to his knees in the snow. His muscles screamed from the long ride, and his head swam with hunger and fatigue. He leaned against a tree, listening to the creak of leather and the wind sighing through the branches. For the first time in days, there was silence. No engines, no gunfire, no voices calling his name. But peace was a fragile thing in these parts. As the sun climbed, he checked Dust's leg, tracing the raw welt where a bullet had grazed him in the chase. "You saved us again, old boy," he said softly. You rememberin' that trail was the only reason we're still breathin'. The horse blinked slowly, then turned his head toward Eli's saddle, the same battered piece of tack that had come with him from the auction. The leather was old, but thick and well kept. It had always seemed heavier than it should be. Eli frowned. What is it? Dust nosed the saddle again, persistent, almost anxious. The sound of metal clinked faintly when Eli shifted it. He frowned, kneeling to inspect the underside. There, beneath the worn seat, a thin strip of stitching ran tighter than the rest. He hesitated, then drew his knife and carefully slit the seam. Something slid out, flat, wrapped in waxed canvas. Eli's hands trembled as he peeled it open. Inside was a folded parchment sealed with a faded emblem of the U.S. Cavalry. He unfolded it slowly, revealing yellowed paper covered in precise handwriting. It was a confession. To whom it may concern, it began. I, Captain Marcus Thornfield, write this in full understanding that I may not live to deliver it. The men of Redstone were betrayed by Dane Harlow Sr., who sought to steal the gold entrusted to our command. I have hidden the evidence and the funds to preserve the truth. Should these words find light, let history judge us fairly. The document bore Thornfield's signature and the official seal of the 7th Cavalry, both authentic, both unmistakable. Eli sat back hard in the snow. The air left his lungs all at once. Dust, his voice cracked. You carried this, all this time. The horse pawed the ground, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Eli's shoulder. It wasn't just instinct. It was understanding, clear as speech. Eli folded the paper carefully and held it close to his chest. He thought of all the nights Dust had stood staring toward the hills, all the times he'd seemed to remember something too heavy for words. The truth had been there all along, hidden beneath the saddle, waiting for someone decent enough to listen. Well, Eli murmured, a wry smile ghosting across his face, guess you were guarding more than memories. He started back toward Silver Creek by afternoon, the trail glittering with melting snow. The wind had quieted, and the sound of the river below was steady and soft. As they neared the valley, Eli could see smoke rising from the ranch, thin, white, and peaceful this time. Clara had kept the place safe. When he rode into the yard, she came running out from the barn, her face pale from worry and sleepless nights. Eli! She caught his arm before he could even dismount. You're bleeding. What happened? I thought you... He caught her hand gently. I'm all right. Harlow's men are done chasing. Clara's eyes widened. Are you sure? Eli reached into his coat and handed her the parchment. Because I've got what they were after. She took it with both hands, reading it quickly. As her eyes traced the words, her lips parted in disbelief. This is his confession. It's real. Dust had it hidden in his saddle the whole time. Clara looked at the horse, tears brimming. He carried this for 40 years. Longer, maybe, Eli said. Kept it safe through war, through owners, through the slaughterhouse. He exhaled, shoulders heavy with everything that had come before. Guess he was waiting for the right fool to listen. Clara pressed the paper against her chest, her voice thick. Eli, this changes everything. With this, Harlow can't deny what his family did. Let him try, Eli said, grim but calm. We'll take it to Sheriff Nolan first thing, then the courts. That night, for the first time in years, Eli slept deeply. The wind rattled the windows, but it wasn't a warning anymore. It was just the land breathing. At dawn, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats outside. Dust stood by the fence, looking toward the eastern hills as the sun rose over them. The light caught his coat and made it shine like copper. Eli walked out, boots crunching over the frost. You done your part, partner. he said softly. Tomorrow we let the world know. The next morning, they rode into town. Clara carried the confession inside a leather satchel pressed close against her coat. When they reached the sheriff's office, Nolan was already waiting. Eli laid the parchment on the desk. Captain Thornfield's words, he said, straight from the grave. Nolan's eyes widened as he read, his hand tightening on the edge of the desk. Good Lord, Carter. This'll bring the Harlows down clean to their foundations. Eli nodded slowly. Then maybe the valley'll breathe easier. Within hours, the telegram wires were humming. Newspapers called it the Redstone Revelation. Harlow was taken into custody by federal officers before sundown, shouting about lies and ghosts. But the confession left no room for doubt. The Harlow name, built on betrayal, was finished. That evening, Clara met Eli by the barn, her face lit by the fading glow of lantern light. She smiled through tears. It's over. Eli looked toward Dust, grazing quietly in the corral. Yeah, he said softly. For all of us. The horse lifted his head at the sound of his voice, ears twitching. He looked content, tired maybe, but peaceful in a way Eli had never seen. Clara touched Eli's arm. What will you do now? He smiled faintly. Start fresh. Maybe this land deserves a new name, one that ain't tied to loss. She tilted her head. Got one in mind? Holbrook's Promise, Eli said. Seems right. The words lingered in the cold evening air like a benediction. As the stars came out, Eli leaned against the fence beside Dust. You carried a dead man's truth, old friend, he said quietly. And somehow, you carried mine too. Dust's ears flicked forward, eyes half closed. He breathed out once, a sound like relief, then lowered his head to graze again. Eli watched him for a long time, the world settling into stillness. The wind moved through the grass like a sigh. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled faintly one last time, as if Captain Thornfield himself was giving thanks. Winter eased its grip on the valley soon after. Snowmelt turned the creeks loose again, and Silver Creek ran bright and full for the first time in years. Grass began to stir on the high slopes, tender green pushing through the thawed earth. For the folks in Clearwater, life went back to its steady rhythm, but for Eli Carter, nothing was quite the same. The Redstone affair had rippled far beyond Wyoming. Reporters came and went, scribbling notes about the old rancher and his warhorse, snapping photographs Eli never asked to see. The story made the Denver papers first, then spread across the territories like prairie fire. By the time spring rolled in, letters had come from historians, museums, and even soldiers' descendants wanting to shake his hand. But Eli didn't care much for the noise of fame. He'd done his part. Justice had found its way home, and the truth no longer slept in the cold earth. All he wanted now was quiet, and to make good on the promise he'd made to himself that night in the barn. So he rebuilt the ranch. Every morning he rose before sunrise, the air sharp with dew and the smell of thawed soil. He fixed the roof first, nailing new boards into the old beams until they stopped leaking. Then the fencing, mile by mile of weathered posts replaced with fresh pine. Clara helped him when she could, her laugh carrying across the yard like birdsong. She'd taken to visiting often, checking Dust's leg, checking on Eli too, though she pretended otherwise. The ranch took on a new kind of life. A few months later, with the money the government awarded for his role in uncovering the Redstone truth, Eli opened a small pasture shelter for abandoned and broken animals. He called it Holbrook's Promise, just like he'd said he would. He didn't hang a sign. Word just spread. First came an old mare a farmer could no longer feed. Then a half-wild colt, left limping near the rail line. Clara helped nurse them back to strength, and slowly, the place filled with the quiet sound of new beginnings, snorts, soft nickers, hooves shifting in straw. Through it all, Dust remained the heart of the place. The old gelding had slowed with the warm months. His steps were careful now, his once strong muscles lean beneath a coat gone silver around the muzzle. Still, there was a brightness in his eyes whenever Eli walked near. Sometimes Eli would catch him standing on the ridge at sunset, gazing east where the mountains turned red as flame. "You're looking for your old captain again, aren't you?" Eli would murmur, resting a hand on the horse's neck. "Don't you worry. He's at peace now. We all are." In May, Clara brought a newspaper to the ranch, folded open to the front page. "They named the new museum wing in Denver after Captain Thornfield," she said, smiling. "The exhibit opens next month. They're displaying the artifacts you found. The buckle, the clasp, even that confession." Eli nodded, quiet pride softening his weathered face. "That's good. Man deserves his name back." "They invited you to the ceremony," Clara said. He chuckled low. "Ceremonies ain't my style, but you tell him I'm grateful." Days passed in long stretches of calm work. Summer came golden and dry, the heat shimmering over the valley like a living thing. The air was thick with bees and hay dust, and the smell of wild sage carried down from the high ridges. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in amber, Eli noticed Dust wasn't by the fence where he usually stood waiting for supper. He searched the yard first, then the barn. Finally, he found him halfway up the ridge beyond the house, the same spot where he'd stopped that first day they'd come home from the auction. Dust was standing in the tall grass, head lifted toward the horizon. The wind rippled through his mane, and for a heartbeat, he looked just as he had months ago, strong, timeless, touched by something bigger than the world. Eli climbed the slope slowly, his joints stiff, his breath catching. When he reached the top, Dust turned to look at him, eyes dark and gentle. "You came up here to watch the light again, huh?" Eli said softly. "Can't say I blame you." He stroked the horse's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coat, the steady but slowing heartbeat. Dust's breathing was deep, almost like a sigh. Eli sat down beside him in the grass, hat in his hands. The wind carried the sound of the creek below, the faint creak of barn doors swinging loose. For a long while, neither of them moved. Then, as the last edge of sun dipped behind the hills, Dust sank to his knees, slow and deliberate. Eli leaned forward instantly. "Easy, old boy. It's all right." The horse settled into the grass, head lowering to the earth. Eli stayed with him, one hand resting on his neck. "You did enough," Eli whispered. "You kept your promise. You carried the truth. Now you can rest." Dust's breathing steadied once more, then grew shallow. The world seemed to hold its breath, and as the final light of day spilled over the ridge, the old gelding exhaled one last time, soft, peaceful, like the wind itself leaving the valley. Eli sat beside him until the stars came out. When he finally rose, he placed a hand over the horse's still heart. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." The next morning, Clara helped him bury Dust on the ridge. They marked the grave with a simple wooden cross, carved with the words, "Holbrook's Promise." He remembered. Afterward, Eli stood for a long time, hat pressed to his chest, the breeze moving through his hair. The sun climbed high, and the world around them seemed newly alive, grass bending, river running, swallows cutting through the blue sky. Clara touched his arm gently. "You okay?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think so. Funny thing, feels like I ain't alone anymore." In the months that followed, Holbrook's Promise grew. The ranch became a sanctuary not just for animals, but for people too. Veterans, drifters, anyone needing a second chance. Eli worked every day, slower now but steady, the kind of peace that doesn't need words filling his days. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the east, it carried the sound of hooves, faint, distant, like echoes of memory. Eli would pause and smile, tipping his hat toward the ridge. "Ride easy, partner," he'd say. "You earned it." And in that quiet valley, where kindness had once seemed a fool's act, the story of a man and his horse became legend. Not for gold or glory or revenge, but because one man chose mercy over pride, and one old horse remembered enough to lead him home. When autumn came again, Eli sat on the porch, watching the sky turn red over the mountains. The breeze brushed his face, warm and soft. Somewhere, the wind settled and the land breathed easy. He raised his coffee cup toward the fading light. "Here's to you, Dust," he said. "You changed everything." The air was still for a heartbeat. Then, from far across the valley, came a single, distant whinny, clear, strong, and full of life. Eli smiled. "Yeah," he whispered, "I hear you." And for the first time in years, the man of Silver Creek Ranch felt whole. If this story found a place in your heart, let me know down in the comments. Just drop a simple 1 if you felt something, or a 0 if you made it all the way to the end with Dust and Eli. Your small comment means more than you think. It helps stories like this reach others who still believe in kindness, loyalty, and second chances. And if you'd like to ride with us again through the next tale from the Old West, full of dust, wind, and a little bit of heart, make sure to subscribe and keep your saddle ready. Until next time, partner, keep your word, keep your faith, and keep your heart open.